The new girl arrived on a cold morning when the sky was a heavy gray and the wind whispered secrets down the long, empty halls of the old dormitory, 17A. She moved quietly, almost like she did not want to be noticed yet, the moment she stepped through the worn wooden door. A strange stillness settled over the other residents, as if the air itself had thickened. She carried no luggage, only a small, worn backpack slung casually over one shoulder, and her eyes scanning everything with a cautious intensity. That made it clear she was no ordinary newcomer. They called her Lena, at least that was the name on the crumpled slip of paper she handed to the dorm supervisor. But from the moment she arrived, she said little to no one. The other girls in the dorm were quick to speculate, whispers spreading like wildfire through the narrow corridors. Some said she must be from a faraway place because her accent was soft but unfamiliar. Others guessed she was a runaway, escaping something darker than the cold, winter outside. Yet no one dared approach her directly because there was something in her gaze that held a silent warning. Her room was the smallest on the top floor, tucked in the corner just beside the old fire escape, and despite its modest size, it was immaculate, every item placed with careful precision, as if disorder might summon unwelcome memories. The window looked out onto the cracked pavement below, where a stray cat watched her arrival from its usual spot on the broken fence. She spent most of her first day unpacking the few belongings she carried, carefully folding each piece of clothing and stacking them neatly on the single shelf. Her movements were deliberate, slow, but there was a grace to how she did everything, as if each action was a ritual she had performed countless times before. But for what purpose, no one could guess. At dinner, the communal room buzzed with chatter and laughter. Yet Lena sat alone at the far end, her plate barely touched as eyes from across the room tracked her every move. People stole glances, but their curiosity was laced with unease because no one could tell what she was really thinking or feeling. Late that evening, when the lights were dimmed and the dorm settled into a low murmur of whispered conversations and the soft creaks of old wood, she stood by the window, looking out at the city lights that flickered like distant stars. She clenched her fists briefly, then released them as if trying to hold back a storm brewing inside. Suddenly, the door across the hall slammed shut with a sharp bang that echoed through the corridor, causing heads to turn and breaths to catch. The moment seemed to stretch and hang in the cold air like a question waiting to be answered. But no one moved to investigate, leaving a heavy silence behind. No one knew where she came from or why she chose 17A. But a quiet rumor began to take shape in the shadows of the dormitory that Lena was not just a lost girl, but something far more dangerous. Something that would change everything they thought they knew about their quiet little world. As the night deepened and the hours stretched endlessly ahead, the name Viper whispered in hushed tones behind closed doors, but nobody dared to say it aloud for fear that saying it would summon the secrets that had been buried far too long. And so the first day ended with the dorm 17A holding its breath, waiting for what the morning would bring, because once you heard the name Viper, nothing would ever be the same again. Days passed, and the dorm slowly settled back into its usual rhythm, but the new girl remained an enigma. No one knew her past. No one dared to ask, yet the air around her grew heavier with unspoken questions. Strange things began to happen just beneath the surface of the ordinary routine that everyone clung to as if it were a lifeline. The other girls noticed the scars that Lena tried to hide beneath her long sleeves, faint thin lines that looked like they told stories of battles fought and won or maybe lost, but who would fight a kid like her? Even the guards who patrolled the grounds glanced at her differently now. A few exchanged quick words behind closed gates, glancing her way with a mixture of respect and caution. It was as if they recognized something in her that the others did not. But when asked, they only shook their heads and said nothing at all. Rumors spread fast like wildfire fueled by curiosity and fear. Some whispered that she was a mercenary sent to clean up old debts. Others claimed she was running from a secret organization that hunted people like her. But none of these theories explained why the dorm seemed to hold its breath every time her name was mentioned, even though she never said it aloud. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Lena sat in the common room, her gaze fixed on the window, but her mind far away. Her fingers traced absent-mindedly the edge of a book that lay open on her lap, but the words did not register. She was waiting for something or someone. The fire escape door creaked open slowly, and for a moment the room fell silent. The other girls turned to see a tall man step inside, his face shadowed under the brim of a worn hat, and his eyes cold as winter ice. He scanned the room briefly before stopping on Lena, who remained perfectly still, as if she had been expecting him all along. He spoke one word that rippled through the room like an electric current. Viper. The name sent a shiver down every spine, and the atmosphere shifted from curious to tense in an instant, but Lena did not flinch. Instead, she stood slowly, with a calmness that belied the storm beneath her skin. The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, telling tales of debts unpaid and alliances broken, but no one could tell if he was friend or foe. The other girls held their breath, unsure if they should intervene or run, but Lena met his gaze steadily, her eyes glinting with something fierce and wild. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed down the hallway, making everyone jump, and the man's head snapped towards the sound, his expression flickering with surprise and anger. Before anyone could react, he turned on his heel and vanished into the shadows, leaving a lingering question hanging thick in the air. Who was he, and what did he want from Lena? The dorm returned to its uneasy calm, but something had changed forever. The quiet girl in 17A was no longer just a mystery. She was a force that no one dared to ignore, and the name Viper had become a warning whispered in fear and awe. That night, the hallway lights flickered, and strange noises echoed down the stairwell, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone, living in the dorm, and a sudden chill that wrapped itself around the rooms like a ghost refusing to leave. Lena stood once again by her window. The city sprawled beneath her like a silent witness. She clenched her fists harder this time, her jaw tightening, as if preparing for a battle she knew was coming. But the question remained, who would strike first? And far away, in the dark corners of the city, the name Viper was spoken again this time, not as a rumor but as a call to arms, a signal that the game had begun, and no one in 17A would be safe anymore. The night grew darker and colder as shadows lengthened across the dorm. 17A, and a restless energy simmered beneath the surface like a storm waiting to break. Lena moved silently through the dimly lit hallways, her footsteps barely making a sound, as if she had learned to become part of the darkness itself. The fire alarm shattered the stillness with a sudden piercing scream that ripped through the building, setting hearts racing and bodies into frantic motion. Girls scrambled from their rooms, some stumbling in the confusion, and others shouting orders, trying to keep control. But Lena was different. She moved with a calm precision, as if the chaos was nothing more than a carefully planned dance. She knew exactly where to go and what to do. Her eyes flickered to the cracked window in the stairwell, where moonlight spilled through, casting strange patterns on the walls. It was the only escape route left when the main doors were locked tight and guards blocked every corridor. The crowd surged behind her, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the perimeter, as she slipped out into the cold night air. The sound of footsteps followed her, each one deliberate and measured like a hunter stalking its prey. But Lena did not look back. She could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Yet she did not falter. Instead, She quickened her pace, heart pounding, but mind razor sharp. The city was a maze of shadows, and narrow alleys, her familiarity with the labyrinth surprising even herself. But it was the sudden rustle of movement behind a dumpster that made her freeze. The silhouette of a figure emerged, low and fast-moving with deadly intent. Without hesitation, she reacted a blur of motion that ended with a sharp crack and a figure crumpling silently to the ground. Her breathing steady, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small device that glowed faintly blue. Pressing a button, she sent a silent signal that only a few would understand. The distant hum of a motorcycle engine broke the night as a sleek black bike appeared from the darkness. Its rider pulled up beside her, and without a word, she swung her leg over the seat and they sped away. Into the night, leaving behind the chaos of the dorm and the unanswered questions that hung heavy in the air. Back in 17A, the others were left with nothing but rumors and fear, wondering if the girl they called Lena or Viper was real or just a ghost. That haunted their dreams. The fire alarm stopped, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream, because it spoke of battles unseen and secrets buried deep. The next morning, the dorm was buzzing with frantic whispers. No one could explain. The sudden alarm or the missing girl and the guards were tighter than ever, as if bracing for something worse to come. The name Viper echoed again in hushed conversations, growing darker, more urgent, as if it were a warning written in shadows, and somewhere far beyond the city limits, a man sat watching screens flickering with images of the night's chaos, a cold smile spreading across his face, knowing that the pieces were moving exactly as he had planned. But the question still lingered. Would Viper be ready when the final game began? The dormitory 17A felt different now, as if the walls themselves remembered every whispered secret and every shadow that passed. Through its halls, Lena sat alone on the cracked window ledge, her silhouette outlined against the fading light outside. But inside her mind was a storm of memories and warnings she tried to suppress. Rumors had grown louder, the name Viper, no longer a whisper, but a shout in the dark alleys beyond the city where secrets breathed and dangers waited. A name spoken in fear by those who had lost too much and in hope by those still searching for answers. But Lena was caught in the middle of a war. She had tried to escape. The fire escape door creaked open again that evening, the sound sending ripples of tension through the dorms like a warning bell. A tall figure stepped inside this time. Not a stranger, but someone from Lena's past. Someone who knew the name Viper and what it meant. A face from the shadows with eyes that held promises of pain and betrayal. He moved with a slow, deadly grace, his voice low and dangerous, telling stories of debts unpaid and battles that left scars deeper than any wound. Lena met his gaze without flinching, but the flicker of pain in her eyes betrayed the weight of the past she carried alone. The other girls watched from behind cracked doors and shattered curtains, unsure if they should intervene or disappear into the night. The dorm that had once been a refuge was now a cage tightening around them all, and every whispered rumor grew heavier like a storm, ready to break. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the dorm into darkness, a suffocating black that swallowed sound and hope. The screams began, almost immediately echoing down the hallways, a frantic, desperate chorus that shattered the fragile calm and left no one untouched. Lena moved through the darkness, guided by instincts, honed in years of running and fighting. Her hands found familiar places, weapons hidden in secret pockets, and her breath steady as she prepared for the inevitable battle. But who was the enemy, and who was the ally in this game, played with lives as pieces? When the lights finally returned, the dorm was a scene of chaos, broken glass and frightened faces, but Lena stood in the center, calm and resolute. The man from her past was gone, vanished like a ghost. But his threat lingered in the air like... Poison whispers began again, about Viper and the war that followed her footsteps. Every name connected to her story came alive in hushed tones, with tales of betrayal and loyalty, lost and a destiny that refused to be forgotten. The dorm, 17A, was no longer just a place to sleep, but a battleground for secrets that could destroy them all. And far beyond the city, in a hidden room filled with screens and maps, the warlord watched the chaos unfolding with cold satisfaction, knowing the name, Viper, would soon be more than just a legend, but a reckoning waiting to be unleashed on a world unprepared for what was coming next. The dormitory. 17A had never felt more like a trap than it did now. The walls seemed to close in tighter every hour, like they were holding their breath, waiting for the next move to be made. Lena stood in the center of the common room, her calm exterior hiding the storm raging beneath her skin. She was no longer just the quiet girl who arrived with a worn backpack. She was the Viper, and every step she took carried the weight of battles fought and alliances shattered. The man who had returned from her past was no longer a shadow in the hallway, but a clear and present danger stalking the halls with a deadly purpose. His name was Darius, and he had a score to settle a debt paid in blood and betrayal, but the others in the dorm did not know that yet. They only saw the tension that crackled in the air and the way Lena's eyes darted, constantly watching every corner, every whisper. It began on a night when the rain hammered against the windows like a warning drum. The dorm was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, and just as the clock struck midnight, a single gunshot rang out, breaking the fragile peace. Everyone froze, the sound echoing in the corridors like a challenge, and before anyone could react, another followed fast and sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Lena moved instantly, her body flowing. With the grace of a predator, her instincts screamed danger but also opportunity. She darted toward the source of the shots, her mind racing through escape plans and fight sequences trained into her muscle memory since a time she wished she could forget. She reached the hallway where a door stood ajar, the faint glow of a cell phone screen flickering on the floor near it. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, and the shadows danced on the walls, revealing fleeting glimpses of a figure retreating into the darkness without looking back. The dorm erupted into chaos as screams and shouts filled the air, but Lena was focused. Her attention narrowed on one thing, finding Darius before he could strike again and stop the nightmare from consuming. Everyone in 17A, the others scattered for safety, but a few brave souls tried to follow her, moving cautiously, yet helpless against the unseen enemy. Meanwhile, Darius was moving with purpose, his every step calculated and silent as he slipped through the labyrinth of corridors. He had come for revenge, and he intended to leave no trace but the scars he would carve into the walls and hearts of those who dared stand in his way. As Lena pursued him, the past clawed its way to the surface memories she had buried deep in the dark recesses of her mind. Flashbacks of a life filled with pain, training, and loss flooded her senses, threatening to unravel her control. But she forced herself forward, knowing that stopping now meant losing everything she had fought for. Suddenly, a figure blocked her path, a young girl from the dorm 17A, trembling and wide-eyed. Lena caught her before she fell, whispering fiercely that she had to stay hidden, that the danger was far worse than anyone imagined. But even as she spoke, the sounds of footsteps approached faster and louder, signaling the arrival of Darius and the inevitable confrontation. The hallway became a battleground, lit by flashes of movement and the harsh clang of a struggle. The others could only watch from a distance, hearts pounding as Lena and Darius clashed like two storms colliding, neither willing to yield. Each strike was charged with history and pain, every dodge a desperate bid for survival. At one point, Lena was pushed back against the cracked wall breath coming hard, but her eyes blazing with fierce determination. It was then that she whispered the name Viper louder than ever, before a declaration of who she was and what she was capable of. The words seemed to hang in the air, turning the tide momentarily, as Darius hesitated, his expression twisting with recognition and fury. The fight resumed with renewed intensity, and just as it seemed the balance might shift, Lena pulled out a hidden blade from her sleeve, moving with a speed that left everyone breathless. She struck a precise blow that sent Darius sprawling to the floor, but the victory was fleeting because before she could catch her breath, a sharp whistle cut through the room and reinforcements emerged from the shadows. The dorm was no longer safe, and the battle spilled out into the halls with chaos and confusion blurring the lines between friend and foe. Lena and Darius were locked in a deadly dance, but the others were caught in the crossfire, trapped between fear and the need to survive. As the night stretched on, the first light of dawn crept through the cracked windows, revealing the scars left behind. The air was thick with smoke and silence, and the haunting question of who had truly won the night lingered like a ghost. And in the cold early morning, somewhere far away, a voice spoke into a phone, the words calm but deadly. "We have her, but the game is far from over." The name Viper had become a legend written in blood and fire, and the next move was waiting to be made. The dawn broke over dorm, 17A casting pale light through the shattered windows and broken frames. The air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of smoke, but the silence was heavier than any sound that had come before. It was a silence that pressed on the skin and seeped into the bones, making the survivors hold their breath, as if waiting for something worse to arrive. Lena stood alone in the hallway, her figure framed by flickering emergency lights, her body bruised and battered, but her eyes sharp and unyielding. The battles of the night had carved deep lines across her face, yet there was a fierce determination burning like a wildfire beneath her skin. The name Viper was no longer a secret, whispered in shadows. It was a mark branded on the hearts of those who had witnessed the storm she had become. The others gathered in small clusters, nursing wounds and sharing stories in low voices, the terror of what had passed binding them together like a fragile thread. Some looked at Lena with awe, others with fear, but none could deny that the dorm had changed forever, and that the girl they once saw as quiet and unassuming was something else entirely. Outside, the city stirred awake oblivious to the war that had raged within its walls, but Lena knew better. The world beyond 17A was a battlefield too, a place where shadows moved with deadly intent, and every step could mean life or death. She had thought she could escape that world find, some small corner to call home, but the past had found her and dragged her back into its relentless grip. As the morning light grew stronger, a voice cut through the quiet, the sharp sound of a door opening and heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. Lena turned her gaze toward the entrance, where a group of armed men appeared, their faces grim and their eyes hard as steel. They carried no weapons, but their presence was enough to send a shiver through the room. The leader stepped forward, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, and a cold smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke softly, but with authority, telling the survivors that the dorm was now under new protection and that no one was to leave without permission. The rules had changed, and the game was far from over. Lena met his gaze without fear, but her mind was already racing, trying to figure out their true intentions. Were they allies or enemies disguised as saviors? She could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on her, and the knowledge that the only way to survive was to stay one step ahead. Meanwhile, far from the dorm in a hidden command center, the warlord watched the images of 17A flickering on multiple screens. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the console as he smiled darkly, knowing that the chaos had only just begun. The name Viper was spreading like wildfire, and soon the entire city would learn to fear what she was capable of. Back in the dorm, the survivors began to rebuild their shattered home, but the scars ran deeper than the walls could hold. Some whispered of escape plans, others of revenge, and some simply of surviving another day. Lena knew that none of them would ever be the same, and that the real battle was only just beginning. She found herself standing once again by the window, looking out over the city, the skyline blurred by morning mist. But in her heart, the vision was clear. A world filled with shadows, secrets, and a war that refused to end. She clenched her fists tightly, feeling the familiar surge of power and pain intertwined. The name Viper was more than just a legend now. It was a promise of strength, resilience, and a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of everything she thought she knew. The past had returned, but so had the fire within her, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, a soft sound behind her made her turn. It was the young girl she had saved during the chaos, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She took a hesitant step forward and whispered a question that hung heavy in the air. "What happens now?" Lena looked down at her and for the first time allowed herself a small smile. The answer was uncertain, dangerous, but also filled with a fierce determination. This was no longer just about survival. It was about fighting back, about reclaiming control in a world that tried to swallow them whole. "We fight back," she said, her voice steady and low, "and together we make sure that the name Viper is one they will never forget." Outside the city, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the streets, but inside Dorm 17A, a new chapter was beginning. The past had come calling, but Lena was ready to face it head-on. No longer just a kid in 17A, but a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of hope and defiance in a world that had tried to break her. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of sirens mixed with the growing hum of the city life, a reminder that the war was far from over, but so was the fight for the girl called Viper. The sun had fully risen, casting long, pale fingers of light through the fractured windows of Dorm 17. But the light brought no warmth, only a stark clarity to the wreckage that lay strewn across the cracked floors. Broken furniture, splintered glass, and scorched walls all whispered the tale of the night before, a tale soaked in blood and fear, but also in survival. Lena stood motionless in the center of the common room, her body aching with bruises and cuts that screamed of battle, but it was her eyes that held the fiercest fire. A flame that refused to be extinguished no matter how dark the night had been or how many enemies had tried to snuff it out. Her fists clenched tightly at her sides as she surveyed the remnants of what had once been a refuge, now a war zone. Around her, the few survivors moved cautiously like shadows, afraid to draw too much attention in a place where danger still lurked unseen. The dorm was no longer a safe haven, but a battlefield, scarred by secrets and lies, and the lines between friend and foe had blurred beyond recognition. The tall man with the scar, the leader of the armed group that had arrived at dawn, paced slowly among the survivors, his gaze sharp and calculating. He was a man who had seen too much and lost even more, and yet there was a strange respect in the way he looked at Lena, as if recognizing a kindred spirit forged in fire and shadow. He spoke finally, his voice low but steady, announcing that the dorm was now under the protection of a covert faction dedicated to rooting out the darkness that had crept into the city. But his words carried an unspoken warning that freedom would come at a price, and loyalty would be tested. Lena listened carefully, weighing every syllable, her mind a whirlwind of plans and possibilities, a knew that accepting help from strangers was a gamble, but so was facing the enemies that hunted her alone. The name Viper had become a beacon for both hope and danger, and she could no longer run or hide. Later, she found herself alone on the rooftop. Overlooking the city skyline, a panorama of towers and rooftops kissed by the morning light. The city stretched out like a vast maze full of secrets and shadows, and beneath its surface a war was brewing, one that she could no longer ignore. Her thoughts drifted to the young girl she had saved the night before, the scared, fragile thing, who had looked at her with wide eyes filled with both fear and a desperate longing for something safe and real. Lena knew that the girl represented more than just an innocent caught in the crossfire. She was a symbol of what was at stake. Suddenly, the faintest sound reached her ears, a whisper carried by the wind, the softest hint of movement behind her. She turned sharply, drawing a small knife from her jacket, her senses razor sharp, even in the quiet light. But it was not an enemy who stood before her, but a figure she had thought lost forever. The man from her past, the one who had chased her through the halls of 17A with vengeance in his eyes, stood in the shadows, his face unreadable, but his presence a thunderclap in her heart. He stepped forward slowly, the tension between them thick as the night that had passed their history, a tangled web of betrayal, pain, and unspoken truths. He spoke at last, a single word that hit her like a blow: forgiveness. But it was a question as much as a plea. Lena lowered her blade, her breath catching in her throat, because forgiveness was a path she had long feared to walk, but the cracks in her armor were deeper than she admitted even to herself. The name Viper was not just a shield or a weapon, it was a mask hiding wounds that no fight could heal. They stood there in the fragile dawn, the city breathing beneath them, and for a moment the past and present collided in a silent conversation where words were unnecessary, yet everything was said. The war outside the walls of 17A was far from over, but here, on this rooftop, something shifted below the rooftop. The dorm was waking to a new day filled with uncertainty and hope. The survivors moved with cautious purpose, rebuilding what had been broken, but carrying with them the scars of the night and the memory of the girl called Viper, who had changed everything. And as the sun climbed higher, Lena knew that the fight was only just beginning. The shadows would come for her again, because the name Viper was a promise written in blood and fire, a legend in the making that would either save a city or destroy it. She turned away from the rooftop, edged the weight of the past on her shoulders, but also the spark of something new in her heart. A future shaped not by fear, but by the fierce determination to take control of her own story and to protect those who could not protect themselves. As she descended back into the world below, the streets hummed with life and danger intertwined. The game was far from over, but Lena was ready. The name Viper was more than a name now. It was a legacy and a warning to all who dared cross her path. And somewhere in the distance, the city whispered its secrets and waited for the next move in a deadly dance where only the strongest survived, and where the girl in 17A was no longer just a kid, but a force that could change everything forever.